Okay, so we have three esteemed speakers, and the first one is going to be Professor Sotiria Grek, who is based at University of Edinburgh. Uh, Professor Grek works on education governance, particularly European integration, knowledge production, knowledge economy, and issues of global public policy. The next speaker is Dr. Tor Sorensen, my colleague at the University of Glasgow, and he works on global education governance and public policy analysis, and also focuses on teaching profession and teacher education. Our third and final speaker is Dr. Katri Eeva, who is based at Tampere University in Finland, and she's a postdoc fellow there working on education policy, power, and education governance. So, Sotira, the floor is yours if you would like to get started, and I will remind you if you're close to the 15-minute mark.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you very much, Jack, and thank you to Dilrabo for the invitation to give this talk. I think this topic of Europeanization is kind of the enduring interest of mine since really the start of my academic work. I have these pictures here of these gorgeous Georgian gardens in Edinburgh, and I thought, it's for me, it always works as a really they work as a good metaphor for kind of thinking about Europeanization of education. In the sense, these Georgian parks, the gardens are accessible, available, to the people that live around them in the area, to those that have kind of keys to walk in them, to go and enjoy, the wildlife, the trees, the beauty of the green spaces. At the same time, interestingly, they're also closed off to the wider public. You can see there are walls built around them, so they're not as accessible as one would have normally expected for a park in a city to be. And I think this is really if you like, the essence of what we talk about when we talk about education in Europe. On the one hand, a unified space of exchange, of mobility, not only through the last kind of 70, 80 years, since the EU was formed, but actually like through the centuries, as I will talk about in a moment, but also a space that is constructed, that is in a sense bordered, and would like to remain as such. We've seen in recent years the migration crisis and how this has been treated in terms of EU governance, also in relation to education. But we also know that in the field of education, EU also wants to portray itself as a global actor and, in a sense, move these European educational values and ideas to other world regions. So it's an interesting case, that case of the Georgian garden in Edinburgh, as one that is served by some and closed off to others. So Tori, if you can move on to my first slide. Really, this is really the first slide. But I guess this is why Europeanization has also interested me. And I think that's why it continues to be a question, right? And a question that we always consider. I mean, it was like that, around 2006 when I got my first job and we're discussing Europeanization of education. And like almost 20 years later, we're still asking, is this really a research field? Should we be considering that? And I think the answer to this question is precisely this, that Europeanization as a question, not only in education, but in fact across the board in different kind of social policy, kind of public policy areas, should really be seen as a problem that generates new interesting questions, not really the solution. So the concept of Europeanization is in search of an explanation continuously. Precisely, of course, as you understand, because Europe itself is constantly changing. And in a sense, I think this continued attraction to this field is precisely the fact that it's not a settled field. So if I were interested and did quite a bit of work, say, for example, in the past on OECD and PISA, well, many people might say, okay, the field has moved on a little bit now, yeah? But this enduring question of Europeanization always is there, because Europe is always there and will always be in many cases, or in many senses and forms. Even for those countries like, unfortunately, the one that I live in, or Tore, and you, Zach, that, has really experienced the Brexit, and you can say, okay, so what would the UK have to say, or England, Scotland, around Europeanization? Well, still, even for those countries that are outside that formal EU border, there's still a lot that is being done here in terms of this European networking and connections. Okay, so just moving on to my next slide, Tore. Thank you. So there's this problem, I guess, and it has been with us for a very long time, and I can't see it easily going away. Maybe this is part of why this is an interesting topic to research on. So on the one hand, there is this broad kind of understanding of Europeanization as a cultural process, particularly in the fields, in the disciplines, within arts and humanities, and, to a degree in social sciences as well. So there is this idea that Europe is a space of exchange, that kind of brings different peoples together, different cultures together, and should be understood as such. So it's not, has little to do just with the EU, but it's a much longer and more complicated process. So this is kind of a cultural history, if you like, of Europe and processes of Europeanization as Europe has been kind of constructed through the different centuries. On the other hand, of course, we as academics know that there is this field, very important field of EU studies, and the influence, I guess, of political science on the emergence of the field of the EU integration studies, where, really the examination here is a very different one of the extent to which European political processes, as they take place within the EU, affect domestic policy change. Does this happen? Doesn't it happen? How does it happen? And this is, I guess, the space where a lot of us come to when we discuss Europeanization of education. Can we even talk about Europeanization of education when we know there is this rule of subsidiarity? So the EU really has no direct effect on the kinds of decisions that are taken at different European education systems. I mean, I am editing the European Education Research Journal, and the most common question that comes to us is that I want to write a paper on my country. I don't, how does this relate to the EU or Europe? Why should I have to have this kind of angle in it? Okay, so Tore, if you can move on, thanks. So, and really, this is, I guess, where the problem lies, not only in education and the way that it sees Europeanization, but more broadly, that in a sense political science and its influence has kind of led us to a large degree to think about the measurement of the extent or not of Europeanization in terms of this logic of misfit. Domestic policies should be seen as going one way and Europe the other way. If there is this kind of convergence, then we talk about Europeanization. If not, we talk about Europeanization not happening. So in many senses, at least in the political science way of thinking and understanding Europeanization, Europe has kind of to be seen as uncomfortable with domestic institutions, or kind of leading to different kinds of policy effects. Tore, if you can move on. Thanks. So quite a few years ago, I think it was 2012, I was really lucky to have worked closely with Martin Loan, who I guess I see as one of the fathers, if you like, of this notion of thinking about Europeanization of educations. So back then we wrote this book it was called Europeanizing Education, and there kind of we made some arguments about the way that we saw the emergence of a European education policy space. And although now, 12 years later, we are talking about the construction of a European education area as kind of outlined by the EU itself and promoting it, back then, this was an argument that was a very controversial one, and we had, quite a few people, in fact, in different conferences and places that we were kind of presenting this work, asking, really, where do you see that? Is this kind of some fantasy project? We don't really see it happening. But we were because what we saw and what we're investigating was kind of the Lisbon agenda. So the kind of this first 10 years of pushing for a specific way of understanding and doing education in Europe. And that was this process of what we called facilitated coordination. So there may not have been direct rulings that came from the EU to education systems in Europe, but Europe was kind of creating almost a forum of discussion for the pushing of a very different way of doing education through learning and peer pressure. So the use of benchmarking, indicators, different measurement tools, but also the kind of this concept of peer learning and peer pressure. If you move on, Tore. And that is, I guess, the difficulty of doing research in Europeanization of education. It's not easily observable. It's not easily measurable because it is part of these soft processes. But I think that's why, and as we have seen, as we've kind of progressively moved on, and now this becoming an acknowledged field of research and policy work, the effects of soft law and all these different measurement tools of this kind of facilitated coordination has led to even greater influence, I would say. Maybe not always policy convergence, but certainly ideational convergence. So even if policies might look slightly different from place to place, the directions have become quite, unified, if you like, limited, and this is something that we observe, and we certainly know that it has to do with these processes of Europeanization. So if you like, when I talk about ideational convergence, these cognitive normative value frames becoming, much more, in a sense, similar, converge in many ways. Okay, Tore, if you can move on, thank you. I guess, the question is, how does this happen? And of course, I know that there's plenty of other research. There's also, discussing the idea of nationalism. That, yes, on the one hand, you might have this kind of, not just European, but if you like, global convergence of ideas, but also nationalism, kind of populist movements. And we saw that, of course, in the last European elections. But this is kind of, it's not a new story. It's an old story. And we have to understand, Europe is constructed really on the basis of this binary, on the basis of these two forces kind of pulling apart and coming together again, if you like, continuously throughout history. After the Cold War, again, Europe was kind of in the middle of two major forces, Americanization, Sovietization, the influence of Russia. And the question was then how Europe can become more European. And then, the EU emerged. Or then, as I kind of started the framing of, the discussion of Europeanization is, although a unified kind of connected space is also defines itself as really different, and therefore, wanting to put borders and boundaries around it, not only to externals, but also to the internal kind of subordinates, like, the countries in the Southern Europe, for example. So the fact that Europe does not have the kind of the classic, if you like, elements that you would need to use in order to construct a nation, like religion or kind of an army or this traditional values, it does have kind of these notions of exchange, diversity, the notion of citizenship of a much larger kind of space rather than just the national one, as its way of actually putting itself forward as a progressive, if you like, force in global politics. Tore, if you can move on the slide. And I think this is my last slide. I will leave you with this thought. I think, like, really what I want to propose here, maybe controversially, maybe not, is that, in fact, not only political science has always been, ignoring, education at their peril, I would say. But in fact, it's really a major mistake to believe that education has nothing to offer to EU studies or studies of Europeanization because of the rule of subsidiarity. I would say precisely the opposite. Firstly, because substantively, if we look at what education is trying to achieve, the preparation of future workers, working towards economic prosperity, the preparation of future citizens, building the citizens of the future of this unified space, embodying these European liberal values now and in the future. Therefore, education is a key area of trying to understand Europeanization, not only in education policy terms, in the ones that we look at compulsory schooling, but in fact more broadly in educating European citizens. But I would also say, going back to these arguments about socialization, peer learning, the way that Europe actually is constructed through these processes of sharing, of exchange, that education and its tropes, the way that we do education through meetings, through sitting with one another, through exchanging, is really the key way to understand how European policymakers work with one another. This process of negotiation, mediation, reflexivity, exchange, etc. So I know I tried to squeeze so much here, but hopefully, we'll have a lot of time for discussion, and I can explain more. I'll pass over to you, Tore, for the next kind of part of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sotiria. I think that was very, very interesting. I hope we can discuss some of these things later. So I'm going to pick up on what Sotiria mentioned about the political sciences and their interest in EU governance. So I have been working for some years with a focus on EU governance, especially with regarding to the teaching profession. But of course, teachers are a key labor force in the education sector, so you can't help thinking about education governance when you're talking about teacher policy in EU governance. So I'm going to just present some reflections here about the need to situate the OMC education policy in wider public policy arrangements in EU governance. And I believe that is also what Katri is going to touch upon later in her talk. So I'm going to just to make the argument that, we need to widen the scope sometimes to look beyond education per se and to situate it, because it's becoming increasingly difficult. That's at least an argument based on my work, that's making sense of education policy on its own terms, so to say, and treat it as something isolated from what is going on in other policy domains. It's becoming increasingly difficult, or maybe becoming an increasingly blinkered view to adopt when we try to understand Europeanization and what it means for education sectors. It implies that it's also, if we want to make sense of Europeanization and also the soft power capacities of EU governance, it's important with this public policy lens where we try to situate EU education governance in these wider policy arrangements. I have on my slides included a few references that you can look into, but I'm going to mainly talk about some of my own work over the past years. So what I have done, especially with Xavier Demey from UC Leuven, we have written a couple of articles, including in the special issue in the ERJ, but also in the Journal of Education and Work, where we have tried to think about EU governance of teachers and teaching as the forming of a so-called bridging issue field. And in another paper, we have tried to understand it as a so-called boundary-spanning policy regime. These two concepts have a lot in common. What is central to them is that ideas matter, framing matters, and the way that education issues, teacher policy issues, how they are being integrated, how they are being framed as policy issue that goes beyond education per se is crucially important in our analysis, at least. And what we see there is that, yes, the European Union governance has this is underpinned by this notion of diversity and respecting diversity, but there's always continuously, at least over the last 20 years and probably further back, this need for identifying European solutions while respecting that diversity. But when it comes to the framing of policy issues, this idea that we need to find also European solutions that might take different forms in different settings is absolutely central. And you are probably all aware of the focus on lifelong learning, the need for investment, these notions have been around for quite a few years. Teachers and teaching has also become increasingly prominent over the past 20 years. Teachers as key agents in education sectors, as a European teacher workforce characterized by different working conditions, but still common problems about shortages, recruitment, retention, and so on. The low status in many countries, the status, attractiveness of the profession, that's presented as common European issues to deal with in one way or the other. And there we see that education, understanding teacher policy just as related to education policy doesn't really make a lot of sense, because it also relates to employment policy. It also relates ultimately to economic policy, public administration, and so on. But of course, European Union governance is about more than just ideas, and it's also about the mobilization of networks. And I'm sure you're all quite aware of that, how the European Commission in particular has been quite successful in creating new policy arenas, essentially by mobilizing actors, different sorts of actors. And that's what Xavier Dumais and me are writing about with regard to teacher policy, different types of actors that help to constitute these new policy arenas, or bridging issue fields, as Xavier and I label them, based on the work of Charlene Sitzman and colleagues. And yes, we are focused on teacher policy, but other studies are pointing to some of the same characteristics in terms of the so-called convening power, as Sotiria and Ian Russell calls it in their paper in the special issue that came out in DRJ in March this year. The European Commission is really central, but we shouldn't forget about the other so-called formal units of EU governance, which of course also includes the EU member states, for instance. And I believe Sotiria or Katri will come back to that. But different actors are being mobilized, and that is really key to understanding how EU governance works. Then Xavier Dumais and I have also pointed to the importance of so-called institutional infrastructures. And we think this is really hugely important when we try to understand Europeanization, education and training, and EU governance more broadly. The way that European Union governance has come to involve an ever-growing toolbox, as you could call it, policy mechanisms and specific policy instruments that complement each other, that work in synergy, that create synergies between each other. Some of them related to socioeconomic governance, for example, like the European semester prominently. Also the European Pillar of Social Rights, the so-called Structural Reform Support Service that was created in 2017 and relabeled or integrated as DG Reform in 2020 with the von der Leyen Commission. These all have implications for teacher policy in one or the other ways. And that, again, calls for going way beyond the OMC in just education, if we try to understand how Europeanization is taking shape regarding the teaching profession in Europe, and also in other areas, but that remains an empirical question, of course. And yes, just to point out that, as I said, these different policy mechanisms and policy instruments are becoming increasingly coordinated, and this is quite remarkable since maybe especially the 2010s. We could say that the way that the European Commission, as the executive arm of the EU institutions, have managed to link and create synergies between these different components of governance is really quite remarkable. And we could talk about intersectoral policy coordination. And I have, together with Lucas Graf and Marcelo Marques and Xavier Dumais, written about this in the Journal of Education and Work. We should never forget that, of course, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's always the house, so to say, the walls around EU governance that are certainly, there are gray areas, but the treaty is certainly there. And at least the interviews that I have done with people in the Commission, my work has focused a lot on, especially the Commission, the European Commission as one of the EU institutions, and they are being very aware of how far they can go in the Commission in terms of stretching, of working with the system, how to work with the soft power capacities that this institution has, but they have to respect these fundamental institutional arrangements, and then they can work around it in different ways. For example, through linking education policy with other policy domains. So, in short, to summarize very briefly, and I'm sure that what I've said hopefully will create some discussion, some thoughts among you. So I tried to make a short argument that yes, we should go beyond just focusing on education as education when it comes to EU governance, and that challenges us as researchers to also think about what do we actually mean when we think about education, employment, economic governance, and so on. These policy domains, not least at the national level, are often taken for granted as areas that we can look into and study. But EU governance certainly shows us that we sometimes need to challenge and reflect on what do we actually mean when we talk about sectors in this way. And I have proposed, again, drawing on public policy literature and Europeanization or EU governance, on the EU governance literature, that one way to try to understand this quite remarkable Europeanization in education sectors and beyond, you could trace the framing of policy issues over time, as Xavier and I have done over the past 20 years, regard to teacher policy. You could try also and combine that with the analysis and tracing of how relations between actors and networks have been developing, unfolding, and continue, certainly very much so. And also the importance of these institutional infrastructures that have been put in place and that help to integrate this bridging issue field, or this boundary spanning policy regime, whatever the lens that you want to adopt. So I'll leave it there, and I look very much forward to some questions and some debate. Thank you so much for your attention, and then I'll hand it over to you, Katri.
Hello, everyone, on my behalf too, and thank you, Sotiria and Ture, for introducing the topic and the main concepts that we're discussing today. So my contribution is a rather hands-on outline on Europeanization in education policy in the EU context. And I try to explain what it means to research Europeanization through soft power in perhaps more concrete policy terms. I think we have already covered the fact that education has a special status in the EU because there is no formal power to legislate. But with this title of EU non-competence, I wanted to tease a little with the idea of the blurring boundaries of the competence that Ture already kind of introduced or discussed about and was hinting towards, because the EU does have ways of steering and influencing policy through soft measures, such as the structuring of the EU programs, the European education area that I think I actually don't remember if we introduced the topics, but anyhow, I'm going to go that into more detail later. The Erasmus program, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and the newly established European University consortiums, and of course the Horizon Europe, which is the funding instrument for European research collaboration, which is also a good example of the blurring boundaries in higher education, where science and research policy give the EU more powers to regulate. And as Ture already explained in detail, the EU has various policy instruments that it uses to monitor and evaluate policy developments in member states and also at the EU level. Sotiria spoke about Europe as a global actor, and I think that's a really important notion, because the EU is not the only actor doing the Europeanization work, if you like. There's an increasing number of non-governmental actors, the OECD, the UN, the World Bank, and other stakeholders, stakeholder organizations such as the labor market organizations, universities, academic and research institutions and cultural institutions, and so on. So the EU definitely is not operating in a silo, and therefore Europeanization really cannot be explained only by the EU policy involvement and activity. But today I am focusing on the EU, but I think it was just important top issue to bring up at this point. And Ture, if you don't mind going to the next one. All right, so I'm focusing on soft power today, and argue that it operates discursively, because discourse can kind of co-opt and attract actors to shared meetings, and discourses are often also persuasive if they are seen as evidence-based and reliable. And Sotiria already mentioned that comparative performance data indicators and benchmark are often seen to provide such proof of evidence when they are encapsulated in discourses. And for example, in my special issue article, I focused on a policy instrument called the European Semester, which had incorporated education policy recommendations, despite the fact that EU really has no formal power to legislate the national education systems. And I was actually based in Brussels at the time, working there when the European Semester was established. And among the member states, there was a kind of a cautious kind of a questions starting like, how can the Commission do that? Because, you know, we don't want the EU to say how we should legislate our education systems or how we should formulate the policies. And then I was interested to understand how such a policy instrument that was initially established to coordinate the union's economic policy, in the end, then actually was able to persuade and entice and finally embed education policy recommendations and direct them to member states. So I think this relates to what Sotiria was discussing about the socialization of Europeanization as a facilitated coordination, this kind of what happens through peer learning and peer teaching and that kind of activities. So I think in the end, I actually mentioned a few examples in my article from the European Council's Education Committee, where they started a very informalized joint letter that was addressed to the Employment Committee to say that this is how we would like you to actually discuss education policy, and these are the policy priorities. And that very informal practice turned into a very formalized piece of document. So I think it shows that soft power is not weak. And well, I discussed that in more detail in my article, so perhaps we can actually go to the next slide and maybe look in more detail about the institutions and the EU decision-making bodies. If you don't, sorry, there's some animations to that. Thank you very much. So Council of the European Union is the body where the member states are represented and the government ministers, such as the Minister of Education. And I focused, as I mentioned, on the Education Committee in my special issue article. So Ture, if you don't mind. And the European Commission has the sole responsibility of proposing legislation, which then the Council of the European Union, or the Council as we call it, then negotiates and adopts the laws with the European Parliament. And in the special issue, I know Ture and obviously Sotiria and Ian also, but Vivian Gain also looked at the European Commission working group. So if you want to learn more about the Commission, those are the go-to articles, I would say. But today, Ture, if you don't mind, I think it's the final one. Today, I'm going to focus on the European Parliament, which represents the European citizens, if you like, and all of us have been able to directly elect over 700 members of the European Parliament. And I think this is very topical because the European elections were just actually beginning of this month. And next autumn, we're also going to have the new set of European commissioners. So also for that reason, I thought it's interesting to bring this up now. Ture, if you don't mind moving on. Thank you. I'm focusing on the European Parliament and maybe going more into the core of the making of the transnational education policy, if you like. This is based on a work that ethnographic work that we're doing at Tampere University, where we're looking at knowledge network between Finland and the EU. And we've been doing observations in the European Parliament, also interviews, but we've been present observing these committee meetings. I'm not going to go into too much detail into the committee, but just so that to give a bit of a context, I think the committee responsibilities describe well what Sotiria and Ture have already discussed, that what started as a very narrow policy portfolio has expanding a lot, because the committee is also responsible, in addition to education and school policy and higher education, on cultural policy, audiovisual and youth policy, sports and leisure policy, including the esports, and also information and media policy. So it's really being able to gain more responsibility. But of course, we can discuss whether it has a legislative power. I'm not saying that that's a kind of a direct measure of that, but at least the committee has really gained or expanded its policy agenda. In a nutshell, there are around 30 members of the European Parliament drafting policy legislation that comes from the Commission, and the meetings are actually streamed online. So if you're interested you can find it online. But now perhaps let's move more into the actual kind of a concrete policy work. I chose this policy drafting on the European education area because I thought it might be interesting for all of us as an example. This is a screenshot from the European Parliament's documentation gateway, which kind of describes the drafting process and how it develops within the Parliament, and then within the committee first, and then in the Parliament as a whole. And it also kind of illustrates how soft power gets mobilized and translated into practice. And this visualization kind of provides the conditions for the politics of measurements, that there's a timetable, there's a schedule for how the policy process moves forward. And I'm going to focus on the amendments table in the committee, which is kind of precedes the voting in the committee and then the adoption of the report in the Parliament. So Ture, if you wouldn't mind going forward. So often education policy making, kind of in a generic way, is quite consensual in the EU and the European Parliament, perhaps based on the lack of competence. But of course, politics and ideology are embedded in the discourses, in the text, and they're used to push, obviously, policy agendas. And this is an amendment that was tabled for this European education area report. It's a group of MEPs from Green and Left and non-independent parties, Spanish, Greek, and German MEPs. Just to give an example, when on the left-hand side is the original text piece from the original report, saying that the European Education Area Initiative should provide more and better opportunities for every single European citizen. This group of MEPs have changed it to that it should provide more and better opportunities for everyone in Europe. So trying to make the kind of narrative larger than just the one single citizen, to everyone, include everyone in Europe. And I think this is kind of a nice way of showing how these amendments contain the rhetorical rules for cooperation in the policy sector. And Ture, if you don't mind going to the next one. And also it includes, it shows or describes the interplay between the the policymakers in the committee and also the national politics, and demonstrates how the norms and values and identities are expressed and reproduced in text as kind of a vehicles of discourse. This amendment is for the same policy text by a former education minister from Baltic countries, I think Lithuania, and she's a member of the Conservative Party in the European Parliament. And here you talk about on the left side the challenges that the EU and its member states are facing today, and it's suggested that it requires appropriate educational answers and concerted European action. And this MEP has made it as amendment to change that the concerted European action is only where appropriate. So I think you can maybe get a gist of what I mean, how in text it can kind of use the discourse, embed the discourse, which becomes then powerful when it's in a written form and it's in a document that is voted for by the policymakers that are supposed to represent the EU citizens. Sorry. And Ture, if you don't mind showing the last slide, just very quickly, this is the European Parliament has this is a new kind of a database called Legislative Train, where the EU citizens, but also other stakeholders, policymakers can follow the policy process. And I took a screenshot of the European education area policy process just to show how, firstly, the EU and the European Parliament aims to create this kind of transparency of the policy process, so that anybody can go and check online how the policy process is progressing. But also it seems to make the process look very depoliticized when everything is here, and it's kind of when it's actually in a visual form, it means that there's something going on. It's a sign of maybe measure of a Europeanization, that we can actually have the policy processes online, we can follow it, and there's actually even traffic lights showing whether it's on a red or green, whether it's ready to go, and hence the train metaphor. I leave it here and look forward to your questions, and thank you again for this opportunity to share my work.
Great. Thank you so much for the three of you. Great teamwork to build on each other's work, and going from theoretical, conceptual to empirical and practice. I'm just going to stop the recording before we go to Q&A, so people don't feel shy about